Hi everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Dami and I'm an architect based in Vancouver. So today we're going to be talking about environments that has historically led to innovation. So I became really interested in this topic about 4 years ago when I was writing my architectural thesis. In the past decade or so, there's been a huge trend in open and flexible office spaces. They dissolve the physical boundaries like walls, and they allocate more space to the casual and non-program spaces. And there's also a breakdown of hierarchy, less focus on the corner office and more focus on the communal gathering space. This wasn't the solution for every office. Some firms who've tested it found that it was very distracting and counter-effective. I think anytime something becomes trendy, there's a tendency to replicate the look without actually understanding the principles. I really wanted to try to understand this idea of the innovative environment and just trying to answer this question of, is there really such a thing as an environment for innovation? So I just want to talk about some of these ideas through a case study, a building known as Building 20. It was a temporary building at MIT built to help the war efforts during World War II. It was known as a magical incubator, and it was the birthplace of some of the greatest intellectual achievements throughout the century, from high-speed photography to the physics that created microwaves. And it's particularly interesting because the building, it wasn't really designed. It was designed by a local architect in like one afternoon, and it was put up extremely fast. Building 20 was initially built as a temporary extension to the radiation lab at MIT. It was run down, it leaked, it had bad acoustics, poorly lit, badly ventilated, and it violated the fire code, which is a huge deal. It's almost impossible these days. And the exception was made only with the understanding that it was going to be demolished just after the war. After the war, they decided to keep the building. There was an overflow of students and professors right after the war, and they had nowhere else to go, so they decided to keep the building and put in machine shops or research labs and different types of offices. So here's some of the characteristics of the building. Number one, it was temporary. So the temporary nature of the building meant that they could build new walls or tear them down based on their needs without going through the permitting process. If the science students, if they needed access to sinks, they just put in the plumbing themselves. Gerald Zacharias and his team, developing the first atomic clock, they just decided to remove 2 floors in the lab to make room for their 3-story metal cylinder. If you've built anything in the city, you would know how hard it is to modify anything in a building, let alone tear down 2 floors. Sometimes it can take months and months to get a single permit, and it can get really expensive. So the second characteristic is that it was multidisciplinary. It was occupied by a lot of different groups who knew very little about others' work, but they had very deep knowledge about their own work. They found a campus phone book that showed all the different departments that were in there, and it was the nuclear science department, particle accelerator, gyno lab, adhesive lab, and linguistics department. And here's a story of Amber Bose. So Bose was an electrical engineer, and he would procrastinate from writing his thesis, and he would spend a lot of time in the acoustics lab, which was basically just down the hall. By spending a lot of time there with the help of the acoustic engineers, he invented this unique wedge-shaped speaker that would later found the Bose Corporation. So all these professionals on their own might not have led to a particularly innovative environment, but there was one thing that basically forced them to get together, and it was that the building was practically a maze. So the rooms were very poorly laid out. For example, the rooms on the second floor, they started with numbers starting with ones, and the rooms on the third floor, they started with twos. The different wings, they were given a very confusing sequence, like B was given to A, and where C should be was given to B. People were constantly getting lost and stumbling into different departments. So on their own, they might not have made these serendipitous encounters, but when they were put into this maze-like environment, they were constantly forced into situations where they could have these serendipitous encounters. And the fourth aspect of innovation is serendipity. So history has proven over and over again that serendipity is an essential ingredient in innovation. So what is serendipity? Serendipity has been defined as a happy accident or a pleasant surprise, but it's actually more complex than that. Discoveries are not truly serendipitous unless it helps you fill a piece of the puzzle that you've been poring over. There's a little detail that I left out in Bose's story. It's been left out for some reason in a couple articles that I read, and it's that Bose actually loved music, and before he stumbled into the acoustics department, he'd purchased a hi-fi, and he bought one with the best specs, but he was very frustrated with the sound quality. Apparently it was not very good. So when he stumbled into the acoustics lab, he had already thought of these solutions, and he was able to connect the dots of some of the thoughts that he had already been forming in his mind. So to quote Steven Johnson, serendipity is built out of happy accidents, that's for sure. But what makes them happy is the fact that the discovery that you made is very meaningful to you. So it completes a thought, or what he calls a hunch. It links to a possible connection that you had overlooked. Serendipity happens when we break out of our routines or our task-based environments, and when we put ourselves in environments that are unusual or unfamiliar. And that can be a bit of a problem because we live in a culture of efficiency where we just want the fastest route from A to B. And this can actually limit these opportunities. We also live in a time of specializations. We break up the different disciplines and we divide them into different categories where they can rarely mingle with each other. These scientists and professors who already had deep knowledge in their own fields, they were forced into situations where they could share ideas with people who were studying something completely different. And the fifth characteristic is that it had a horizontal layout. So this might not seem very important, but if you look at a conventional office building or a university building, you have the different departments on different floors, and you have the lobby, and then you have the elevator, which will lead you to your office. And so in this case, the elevator becomes your place for serendipitous encounters. But the problem with this is that once you're out of the elevator, you go into the lobby or you go into your separate offices. And so it doesn't give you that much time for discussions, probably just enough time for small talk. So in Building 20, because it was all horizontally laid out, the chance encounters in these long corridors, they would lead to technical discussions. So Jane Jacobs, who was an urban theorist, she called these conversations knowledge spillovers. And her favorite example was the rise of the automobile industry in Detroit. Basically, in the 1920s, the city was full of shipyards built for the flower trade. And over time, these shipyards became centers of expertise in the internal combustion engine. And almost a century later, these engines became the foundation for powering cars. And a lot of the pioneers from the automobile industry, they actually got started building ships. It's tricky because these situations are not predictable, and so you can't really prescribe them in advance. But we can keep them in mind as we design our spaces for working. So this building was an anomaly, and it would be very difficult to replicate some of the conditions that created this building. But I wanted to share this case study not as an example of something that we should replicate, but to understand the principles behind it, like the importance of multidisciplinary pollination, of serendipity and chance encounters, or knowledge spillovers, or the adaptability of the spaces. And how can we try to apply these principles in the post-COVID era, where a lot of things have moved online? For example, architecture school, it was always centered around the studio environment. Students worked there with other students all day, all night, so that you could share ideas. And if someone was stuck with a problem, you could help them try to solve it. And in turn, it could give you some ideas about your own work. I'm a studio mentor for an architecture studio at Ryerson right now, and it's just very different. Everything is online. We meet regularly to review their work, but we're missing that element of the students interacting with each other, and I can't instantaneously sketch over the students' work, and they can't talk to a friend or a colleague immediately if they have a problem. But at the same time, I think it's been a really interesting opportunity. I was able to participate in the studio from across the country. We had studio profs from France that were in the discussions. And so I feel like it's gonna democratize the discussions and make it open for a lot more people. So I attended the Young Architects Summer Series last month, and we had these networking sessions. And obviously I was extremely skeptical in the beginning, but it actually turned out to be pretty fun and a very positive experience. We had a facilitator who gave us a discussion topic, and we would be randomly put into groups, and we were given a limited amount of time to discuss these topics. People with different commitments or financial barriers can join in on the discussion. Even for people who are shy, who would otherwise not openly interact with others, they can even have a platform for sharing. So maybe if we can move this possibly into a classroom setting or a university setting, where we could have these like multidisciplinary networking sessions, I think that could also be an interesting idea. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Do you think that innovation is gonna stagnate? You think it's gonna explode? What do you think is gonna happen in the post-COVID world? I think this is an ongoing discussion that I wanna have on this channel. So please drop down your thoughts in the comments below. I will respond to you. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, subscribe. And I'll see you in the next video.